I started working in the early 1980s. I studied in Cape Town. It was a time where the sort of united movement, anti-apartheid movement, was really mobilizing. It was a very violent time. From 85 all the way through to the release of Nelson Mandela, there was an almost permanent state of emergency, which meant that the police could arrest, imprison anybody at will, without warrant. There were a lot of demonstrations. There was a kind of united movement. And at the same time, South Africa was fighting a secret war in Angola. And very much the tradition of photography in South Africa was really framed by the political struggle. Photography was sort of a condition of advocacy. It was social documentary. It was about direct public address. It wasn't about a kind of an interrogation into the manner of exposure. Conceptually, it was about revealing the horror of apartheid. And I was very uncomfortable in that medium. I was trying to work out who I was, what my position was, what I could talk about and what I couldn't. And it seemed very complicated as a young white girl to be making commentary about the experience of people who I didn't know that well. So I was always on the edges of things, and I didn't know it then, but I understand it now as we get older and we reframe or re-narrate the way we work. I think even then I was photographing the after or the non-event rather than photographing the action. So these first images are images in the townships. These are waste dumps, resettlement camps. This is Crossroads in 1986, after bulldozers and Caspers and a raid by the police had razed people's shacks to the ground. Right behind me is a whole lot of violence with people and protesters. So it was, at the time, I had a friend who used to talk about Joe's landscapes, and it was, I had a long struggle about these boring images, these images that seemed not to speak about what was happening. And I felt that they were boring. It felt that I was looking for something atmospheric. I was looking for a way to speak without imaging literally the detail. And so that led into a series of images that were photomontages from my own photographs, but it felt like it could be a more metaphorical way of working. So it felt that I could speak about this world gone mad. I mean, it felt like a truly apocalyptic time, and that I could find ways of working that didn't lock me into a subject or a victim or a perpetrator or a person. Imaging a person is particular. Who are they? Are they black? Are they white? How does that get positioned? It just felt too much to take on. So I made this series of images, which was about this pack of dogs that journeyed through a chaotic world. And at the time, I read this extraordinary book called Another Day of Life that was written by a Polish journalist, Ryszard Kapuscinski, which spoke about the 6 months in Luanda leading up to independence. And the book was written, his time there was in 1975. This is 10 years later that I'm reading his book. And what he wrote about in that book seemed imminent in South Africa. It felt like an extraordinary image. And he's been criticized for being an adventurer and a romantic. But there was something about the way that he articulated that moment in Luanda that really just spoke to me. And I had been making the images of dogs before I read the book. They had gotten into my images, but there was a passage in this book where he talks about the Portuguese leaving, this crate city emerging in the concrete city. And after everyone had left, this giant pack of dogs, of greyhounds, Dachshunds, Alsatians, that roamed through the city. And eventually they slimmed down, and as people left, the dogs went hungry, and one day they disappeared. And he fantasizes that if they went north, they might have run into the FNLA, but they might have made it into Zaire or Tanzania. If they went south, they would have probably run into the South African army, and who knows what would have happened. But maybe a leader emerged from the ranks. So that pack became this the story, or the sort of the story of the way that I was thinking about South Africa. I never thought I would go to Angola. I never thought that I would photograph outside South Africa. But then in about 2004, a friend saw an exhibition that showed some of this early work, and he lived in Luanda. He became a friend. And he looked at the work, and without knowing my imaginary of Angola that was projected into these images, he said, "You should come to Luanda." He said, "Your images are just like Luanda. You would love Luanda." And that's how it started. And when I went to Angola, I was not interested in making a statement or making a body of work which was about the condition of Angola. I was really interested in the imaginary of Angola. I mean, I recognized the landscapes of my dogs. I mean, it was, so it was a bit like, and I thought, this is like Mad Max meets the Canterbury Tales. This is post-apocalyptic and medieval, and I'm in both of my worlds. It was where my internal world somehow mirrored the external world. I mean, that's all me, it's got nothing to do with anything else. It's my sort of own projection. But I felt at home there. I mean, it was immediately I found myself in that place for whatever reason. So the first project was called Terreno Occupado, which took its title from the sign that I saw on a vacant plot, which I then subsequently found out, but I found quite a few of them, usually on empty parcels of land. And it was very interesting for me that there were these signs: this place is taken, this place is occupied. And I started thinking of these layers of occupation, from the Portuguese to, to the war, to the South Africans, to the Russians, to the Cubans, and now this new kind of French, American, Chinese, these layers of occupation and disoccupation. And I photographed largely in this large market called Rock Santeiro, which found its name after a Brazilian soap opera, and was this sort of very extraordinary mythical place that kind of held Luanda together all the way through the war. It no longer exists. I mean, a year after I finished this body of work, it was razed to the ground to make way for the building of luxury apartments, because it has a beautiful view. So then I started the process of looking to see how I could actually find my way into tracing those war spaces. And there was a phrase that I came across, which was "As terras do fim do mundo," the lands at the end of the world, which was a phrase used by the Portuguese to refer to their colonies. And even at the moment of independence, I mean, the civil war emerged around Luanda. And people in Angola say, when you talk about Angola, what's Angola? There's the Republic of Luanda and everything else. And the everything else, the lands of the end of the world, was by the Angolans themselves relegated to this large kind of stage for war. These images, these ones that you're looking at, really trace the journey through to the Battle of Cuito Carnaval, which was the battle that really, it was momentous in all ways. It was a momentous battle, but it was this battle that really catalyzed the beginnings of discussions for the end of the war, the end of the Cold War, which was overlaying the Civil War, the beginnings of negotiations for the release of Nelson Mandela, and also for the independence of Namibia. So that's Cuito Carnaval. And these images are on view. So they trace battle sites, they trace routes, they trace minefields, they trace Cuba's presence in Angola. Over 500,000 Cubans fought in Africa during its great internationalist epic in Africa. And they were strong allies for the Angolans. So the work that you've just seen is on show at the Fondation. And then at ERG, there was a project. I thought I needed to look at some kind of manifestation within South Africa. And I had the idea initially of a militarized landscape, but not sites that were associated with the usual apparatus of war, but really sites that were kind of off the radar, that were ordinary, everyday sites that were somehow caught up in the mobilization and the aftermath of this war. And I'm just going to briefly name them, because what they all share are previous histories of dispossession, forced removals during the colonial and apartheid periods. And after the war, currently, they are all sites of land claims. In fact, this first place, which is called Rimfasmark, which means make the thong tight, which has a very old history that goes back centuries, was the first place of restitution in South Africa. So it was the first piece of land to be given back to its original inhabitants after the end of apartheid. And for a period of the 80s, it was used as a way to test weapons, to practice for the war. These are sort of temporary bases where they would go and enact. And these are some of the people who have come back. I'm flipping through them just to give you an impression. And then there's another place in Kimberley, 2 sites called Smitsdrift, where members of a battalion made up of Angolan and Namibian Ku and Kwe San trackers, who were at first recruited by the Portuguese, then recruited by the South Africans, and after the war were brought back to South Africa and given South African citizenship because it was perceived to be too dangerous for them to go back to Namibia, back to Angola after the war, because they fought for the apartheid army. But they are also living in a sort of, their position in South Africa is very precarious. And when they first went back to Smitsdrift, there were claims on the land. They lived in tents for 14 years. The land was awarded back to the original inhabitants. They were given compensation. They were moved to a nearby township, which was created, called Platfontein. They live there now. This is a ceremony of erecting the obelisk from their original base in Namibia. And then the last place, which is a place called Pomfret, was originally an asbestos mine, and then it was converted into a military base for a battalion called 3-2 Battalion, also known as Buffalo Battalion, or in Angola was called Os Terríveis, which means the terrible ones, which was a unit made up of white South African officers and black Angolan soldiers. And it was a special forces elite fighting unit known for its boldness and its brutality. And when the war ended, they were brought back to South Africa, and this mine was converted into a military base. But then the unit was disbanded. And now, of course, the ANC wants to repatriate them. They will refuse to go back. So they live in an abandoned place. It is a place without future. Being squeezed out. There are no services, there are no water, but there are a lot of children. So it's I don't know how to end this because it all sounds terribly bleak. But in some senses, the work was really about trying to look at the complications. Eventually, it sort of lost its thread of Angola, and it was really about how do we find this new way of being at home in a post-apartheid South Africa, which is complicated, where issues around belonging, who belongs, how we belong, how we make a life, how we come together. I mean, there's this fantasy of the Rainbow Nation, but it's not that simple. So it was really about finding a way through these 4 sites, which in many ways speak, I'm just going to put that back to, which speak to those difficulties. So I think I'll end it here.